Anacaona's granddaughter, Mencia, is born around 1500, 1501. We can imagine that Anacaona probably helped her daughter give birth to the only granddaughter we know that she had. The funniest thing is that this hurricane was announced by Colon himself. He had left Spain in May 9th, 1502 with his brothers and with his son Fernando, who was old enough to travel. He ends up going to Santo Domingo, the port of Santo Domingo, even though he had been prohibited, but he needed to make port very quickly. He made port in June 29th just to tell them, look, please don't send out any boats. There's a hurricane coming. But Nicolas de Ovando didn't care. The rest of 1502, Colon just traveled and explored. And then in July 7th of 1503, he became marooned. He got stuck on Jamaica. And on that boat was his 13-year-old son, Fernando. Colon was so desperate that he even wrote a letter to God asking him to please spare them from the death that was surely coming. He wrote that letter in July, but he had already sent out a rescue party. The rescue mission was headed by Diego Mendez de Segura with some indigenous people aboard. The island of Jamaica to the coast of Jaragua wasn't very far, so he literally got there in about 10 days. But he was detained by Ovando and his men for 7 months. He wasn't allowed to even send a message back to Colon, just letting him know that, yeah, he had made it to the island, help was coming. Nothing. Nicolas de Ovando would not allow him to do anything. So what do all of these details have to do with Anacaona? Well, because Ovando decided to basically hold hostage this crewmate of Columbus, he ends up inadvertently giving us an eyewitness to what he did next. Because as Nicolas Ovando was ignoring Colon's warning about the hurricane, ignoring everything else that was being presented to him, he was just concentrating on his desire to pacify the island. And which two regions was giving Ovando the hardest time? Higüey y Jaragua. Diego Mendez became a witness to the cruelties of Ovando. He made it to shore in just 10 days. He left with 6 Spanish men and 10 indigenous people. So he had to make his way to Santo Domingo. And Nicolas de Ovando was living in the precursor of what we know as La Fortaleza de Osama. We know that the Fortaleza as we know it now, this remodeling had begun in this year. This structure had held El mismo Colón imprisoned and his brothers before being sent in chains back to Spain by Bobadilla. And imagine that he also subdued a lot of the indigenous people already in the Osama River Valley, which included Sameaca and her people. So Diego Mendez comes in a hurry, trying to get help for Colón, trying to make things happen, but he comes in the middle of this madman's desire to destroy the indigenous people of the land. He actually sent out a kind of like a spying ship to see where Colón was at, and that was it, just to see. Didn't supply anything, didn't try to rescue him. This trip that Diego Mendez had taken from Jamaica to La Española was something so traumatic, so it marked him in such a way that when he died, he asked for the image of a canoe to be inscribed on his tombstone with the word canoa written into the stone. So even though Nicolas de Ovando had plenty of things to distract him, he could not let go of the fact that Anacaona did not fear him and that Higüey could care less. It could be that Nicolas de Ovando heard about Anacaona's pacifist nature and he thought he could take advantage of that and possibly trick her into imprisonment, similar to what Ojeda did to her husband Caunabo years before in 1496. We know that Ovando took about 300 men on foot and 70 men on horse, but she knew he was coming. So she called to her Yucayeque all of the caciques who were under her command. It is assumed that the Yucayeque was Yaguana, because this was the same village that Bartolome visited when he came to visit her and her brother Beacho, but also to collect the tribute that they had gathered. By all accounts, Yaguana was the largest village or Yucayeque of all the islands. Pedro Martin de Agleria says that it was about 6 miles from the coast. There were large buildings, including a very large cane, which was the house of the cacique that could hold more than 100 people. It was also a theater, an extremely large bate. They performed many areitos. She told her caciques to get ready for the arrival of the Guaniquina of the Christian. Guaniquina meant the great lord of the Christians, or el gran señor. She told them that they should honor him because her goal was to develop a treaty and bring peace for her people.